And hello, everyone. Something has happened that has been whispered about in military circles for years, but no one dared to say aloud. The Russian Nudol system has shown that space is no longer a safe haven for NATO military satellites. One launch, formerly a training exercise, resulted in an effect that has Washington talking about mourning and Europe talking about losing control of orbit. The fact is simple and therefore stunning. After the tests, thousands of kilometers above the planet were temporarily transformed into a zone of uncertainty. Let's immediately outline the route of our conversation. We will analyze what Nudol is and where it came from, why the test with its own old satellite caused such a hysteria overseas, and what the phrase about hundreds of disabled devices really means. Along the way, we will answer two key questions. Did the U.S. really end up without a symmetrical response? And why is it almost impossible to formally make claims against Russia? Watch to the end, because it is the finale that will connect all the dots. It all started long before the sensational headlines. Fact 1. The development of an Echelon territorial missile defense system, later designated A-235 and named Nudol, began back in the late 70s of the last century. It was a response to the development of ballistic missiles and space-based attack weapons. The project was not easy, but consistent, step by step, moving towards completion. Why is this important? Even then, the idea of a multi-channel system capable of working on different types of targets was being laid down. This is not a narrowly specialized interceptor, but the basis for a whole family of solutions. Such a reserve is rarely made by chance. What does this change? When a system has the potential for development, it can survive political and technological upheavals. And here we come to the first sharp turn in history. Fact 2. In the 90s, against the background of political and economic changes, the research and development work on Nudol was frozen. The decision was made under strong external pressure and was presented as a gesture of goodwill. The project, which was almost finished, was put on the back burner. Why is this important? Freezing did not mean destroying the work. Documentation, ideas, and developments remained. They were waiting for their time, and that time came much sooner than many expected. What does this change? When work resumed at the beginning of the next decade, the world was already different, and the tasks facing the system became much broader. Fact 3. Since 2011, Nudol has received a new lease of life. Now, it was not only about missile defense, but also about anti-space defense. The system had to be able to work on ballistic targets and maneuverable spacecraft located at significant altitudes. Why is this important? Space has become a key element of military infrastructure, communication, navigation, intelligence. It all relies on satellites. Losing even part of the orbital group sharply reduces combat capabilities. What does this change? Any system capable of affecting satellites automatically becomes a strategic factor. It is here that Nudol comes onto the stage in full force. Now, for some technical specifics. Fact 4. The Nudol interceptor has a speed that exceeds the speed of a rifle bullet by about 2 times and is capable of operating at altitudes of up to tens of thousands of kilometers. This is no longer near space, but a zone where military communication and intelligence satellites feel confident. Why is this important? Such an altitude means access to a significant part of orbital devices. This is not a point tool, but a means of influencing entire segments of the orbit. What does this change? It becomes possible not only to protect your territory, but also to call into question the stability of other people's space systems. And this is where the most interesting thing begins. The first tests were carried out on an increasing scale. In the middle of the second decade, the first successful launch was recorded. This was followed by tests of a mobile launcher, confirming the flexibility of use. Each new test expanded the understanding of the system's capabilities. Why is this important? A mobile platform means survivability. The system is more difficult to detect and neutralize in advance. This again complicates planning for a potential enemy. What does this change? Nudol ceases to be a stationary shield and turns into a dynamic element of defense. And here we come to the moment that exploded the information space. Fact 5. At the beginning of the third decade, a full-scale launch was carried out. The target was an old domestic satellite, Selena, which had long exhausted its resources. Formally, everything looked like the disposal of space debris, but the effect was much broader. Why is this important? After the launch, massive failures were recorded in the operation of satellites that were above Eastern Europe at that time. It was about the temporary or permanent loss of communication and functionality of a significant part of the devices. What does this change? It is here that the nervous reaction overseas begins, because it is one thing to shoot down your own satellite and quite another to affect other people's systems without a direct hit. The reaction followed almost instantly. Even before the tests, statements were made about the inadmissibility of such missiles and calls to include them in future arms limitation treaties. And after the launch, the new United States Secretary of Defense made a harsh accusation of hypocrisy. Why is this important? Usually such statements are made when a real sore point is touched. Otherwise, the reaction would be much calmer. What does this change? For the first time at a high level, there was an admission that the American space infrastructure is vulnerable to such an impact. Of particular interest were the words that a significant part of the satellites stopped working without physical destruction. They simply turned off. Some are lost forever. Some went out of orbit later. Formally, proving direct impact proved extremely difficult. Why is this important? The absence of physical damage takes the situation into the gray area of international law. There are no debris, no obvious traces of an attack. What does this change? The claims hang in the air. Try to prove what exactly caused the failure, and time passes, and the orbital group is thinning. Another accusation was made. They say that the old satellite was just a cover, and the real testing was carried out on NATO devices using built-in electronic warfare equipment. And the most painful recognition is the lack of a worthy response. Why is this important? The phrase about the impossibility of responding in the same way means a technological gap in a specific area. This is a rare admission for a superpower. What does this change? The balance of power in space becomes less clear, and this forces a revision of strategies that have been built for decades. The culmination of this whole story boils down to a simple and cold conclusion. Nudol has shown that satellites are no longer out of reach. They cannot be blown up, not shot down by debris, but simply deprived of function, blinded, jammed, put out of the game. Emotionally, this looks like a shock to a system that is used to impunity in space. When for decades you look from above and consider yourself safe, the sudden loss of vision is perceived especially acutely. In the coming years, space will finally become an arena of confrontation, where not only missiles are important, but also means of influencing electronics and communications. And the one who learns to act discreetly will gain a decisive advantage. And yet, behind the loud statements and emotional formulations, there is an even deeper layer, without which the story of Nudol remains incomplete. It is about how such systems fit into modern military doctrine, and why their effect is much broader than just a single incident in orbit. The next fact: modern armies have long ceased to fight blindly. Any operation today begins with space. Satellites provide navigation, targeting, time synchronization, and stable communication between headquarters and units. Losing even part of this infrastructure does not just reduce convenience, it breaks the very architecture of troop control. Why is this important? When satellites fail, the Army begins to lose its rhythm. Communication becomes fragmented. Data is delayed. Accuracy of strikes decreases. This is not a catastrophe in 1 minute, but it is an avalanche that is gradually gaining speed. What does this change? A system like Nudol does not necessarily have to destroy hundreds of devices physically. It is enough to temporarily disable key nodes so that the entire structure begins to stagger. And this is the understanding that underlies the current alarming assessments. Now, one more important point, which is often disputed: space debris. Western critics immediately began talking about allegedly irresponsible behavior and a threat to the entire orbital infrastructure. But there is a nuance here that is rarely voiced. Why is this important? Physical destruction of a satellite with the formation of a cloud of debris really creates long-term risks. But in the case of Nudol, the emphasis is on non-physical impact. The device loses function but does not break up into thousands of fragments. What does this change? Formally, it becomes much more difficult to accuse of creating dangerous debris, which means that political levers of pressure work worse. This again returns us to the gray area, where familiar arguments do not work. It is also interesting how the rhetoric changed after this episode. If earlier conversations about the militarization of space were conducted abstractly, now they have acquired concrete outlines. Proposals have appeared for new agreements, restrictions, and rules of conduct in orbit. Why is this important? Usually, negotiations are called for when they feel vulnerable. While one side is confident in its superiority, it is not interested in agreements, and this shift is noticeable to the naked eye. What does this change? A diplomatic game begins, in which each technology becomes an argument at the negotiating table. But Nudol, from a military tool, turns into a political factor as well. Let's look at the situation through the eyes of military planners. For them, the key question sounds like this: how to protect your orbital group? The answers are still disappointing. Satellite maneuvers, backup communication channels, duplication of functions. All this takes time and enormous costs. Why is this important? Orbital infrastructure is created for years. It can be lost much faster than it can be restored. And this creates a strategic asymmetry. What does this change? We have to include in the plans the possibility of degradation of space systems and learn to fight in conditions of limited access to data. And this is a painful process for armies accustomed to technological comfort. Another aspect is psychological. Space has long been perceived as something far from the ordinary soldier. But when navigation or communication failures begin to be felt on Earth, the attitude changes. Why is this important? The realization that your satellite can be turned off at any moment affects confidence and decision-making. This is pressure that cannot be measured in kilograms or kilometers. What does this change? There is a need for backup, simpler solutions, a return to old methods of orientation and control. The irony is that technological progress forces us to remember time-tested approaches again. If you look more broadly, the story with Nudol is a signal to all players. Space has ceased to be a zone of absolute security. It has become the same theater of military operations as land, sea, or air, only with different laws and speeds. Why is this important? The one who adapts to these laws first will gain an advantage for years to come. The rest will have to catch up, often in conditions of a time crunch. What does this change? We are seeing the beginning of a new phase of confrontation, where not only missiles decide, but also algorithms, electronic warfare equipment, and the ability to act discreetly. In the finale of this part, I would like to emphasize the main thing. Nudol is not a myth and not a propaganda image. This is a real tool that has shown the vulnerability of what was recently considered inviolable. And the reaction of the United States, with all its emotionality, only confirms the seriousness of what happened. Write what you think. Will the world be able to develop rules of the game in space, or will the orbit finally become an arena of hidden confrontation? Because it is now that the foundations are being laid for the future in which space will cease to be a neutral space and will become another front of global politics and security.